Imagine this: a country that once ruled the world. Its navy controlled every ocean, its currency decided global trade, its flag flew over 1/4 of the planet. People didn't fear Britain, they depended on it. And then, without losing a single decisive war, without being invaded, without collapsing overnight, Britain stopped being the center of the world. Not because it was defeated, but because it made one decision it could never reverse. Today, America is standing at a very similar moment. Different century, different technology, same structural pressure. At its peak, the British Empire wasn't just powerful, it was the system. If goods moved across the world, Britain touched them. If money flowed, it cleared through London. If trade was insured, British firms backed it. The Royal Navy didn't just protect Britain, it protected global commerce itself. This created something far more dangerous than dominance: dependence. Other nations didn't challenge Britain because challenging Britain meant breaking the system they relied on. Sound familiar? By the late 1800s, the British pound was the world's reserve currency. London was the financial capital of the planet. Britain controlled key shipping lanes, choke points, and trade routes. From the outside, this looked like permanent power. But internally, Britain made a critical mistake. It confused control with sustainability. The empire kept expanding, not because it was profitable, but because shrinking felt like weakness. Colonies weren't held because they generated wealth. They were held because letting go would signal decline. And once power becomes about perception instead of productivity, the math starts turning against you. Britain now had to patrol every ocean, administer far-flung colonies, defend trade routes across continents, maintain global stability at its own expense. This wasn't an empire running on surplus anymore. It was an empire running on confidence. And confidence is fragile. Britain began financing its global role through borrowed money, faith in the pound. The belief that trade would always flow through London. As long as people believed, the system worked. That's the key lesson most history books skip. Empires don't run on strength alone, they run on belief. And belief can break long before power does. Then came World War I. Britain technically won. But financially, it was devastated. Instead of adapting to a changed world, Britain tried to restore the old one. Same global role, same currency dominance, same imperial posture. But the world had moved on. Debt was higher, competitors were rising, and Britain's empire was no longer self-financing. Yet outwardly, it still looked strong. And that's the most dangerous phase any empire can enter, because when the system still works, leaders push it harder. After World War I, Britain reached a crossroads. On the surface, it was still an empire. The flag still flew. The navy still ruled. London was still powerful. But underneath, the numbers were broken. Britain had two choices. Choice one, accept a smaller role in a changed world, scale back the empire, reduce military reach, let the economy heal, even if it meant losing status. Choice two, defend the British pound as the world's anchor currency and maintain global control at the same time. Britain chose option two. This was the fatal mistake. In 1925, Britain returned the pound to the gold standard at its old pre-war value. On paper, this looked like confidence. In reality, it was denial. The pound was now overvalued. British exports became expensive. Factories struggled. Jobs disappeared. But Britain refused to devalue. Why? Because devaluation would signal weakness. An empire's fear perception more than pain. So Britain chose austerity. Wages were suppressed. Interest rates stayed high. Budgets were tightened, not to help citizens, but to protect the symbol of power, the currency. This is the moment Britain quietly turned against its own economy. Instead of adjusting to reality, it forced reality onto its people. And it didn't stop there. To maintain global control, Britain kept spending on overseas military bases, naval patrols, colonial administration. The empire was no longer funded by productivity. It was funded by debt and belief. As long as investors trusted the pound, Britain survived. But belief has limits. Then came the Great Depression. Global trade collapsed. Capital fled. Gold reserves drained. And in 1931, Britain was forced to do the one thing it swore it never would. It abandoned the gold standard. That single moment ended British monetary supremacy, and once the currency cracked, everything else followed. Military reach shrank. Colonies pushed for independence. The empire unraveled, not through invasion, but through economics. Here's the lesson most people miss. Britain didn't lose its empire because it spent too much. It lost its empire because it spent in the wrong order. It protected. Currency before economy, prestige before productivity, control before sustainability. And now, look at America. The dollar is the world's reserve currency. America maintains hundreds of overseas bases. Global trade, energy flows, and finance still run through U.S.-aligned systems. And like Britain, America believes it can manage both forever. But the cost is rising. Debt is historic. Interest payments are exploding. Military commitments are expanding. Supply chains are fragile. Just like Britain, then, the system still works, but only because confidence hasn't broken yet. And that's exactly when empires are most vulnerable. When Britain finally broke, the world didn't notice all at once. There was no headline saying, British Empire is over. No dramatic collapse, no final battle, no single moment. Something far more dangerous happened. The rules changed. Once Britain abandoned the gold standard in 1931, the illusion ended. The pound was no longer the unquestioned anchor of global finance. Trade began rerouting. Capital began searching for a new center of gravity. And power does not tolerate a vacuum. The United States stepped in. But here's the critical point most people misunderstand. America didn't defeat Britain militarily. Britain handed leadership over economically. Because once a reserve currency empire loses credibility, it can't dictate terms anymore. It can only react. After World War II, Britain was still respected, armed, influential, but it was no longer decisive. Its colonies knew it. Its allies knew it. Its rivals definitely knew it. Decolonization accelerated, not because Britain wanted peace, but because it could no longer afford control. Now pause here. This is the part people miss. Britain didn't collapse into chaos. It shrunk, quietly, gradually, irreversibly. Power didn't disappear overnight. Options did. And once options disappear, dominance becomes performance instead of reality. Now compare that to today. America sits exactly where Britain once stood, but in a much tighter system. In Britain's era, trade moved slowly, information traveled late, capital reacted in months or years. Today, markets react in seconds, capital moves instantly, narratives spread globally in minutes. That changes everything. Britain had time to adjust after mistakes. America won't, because the modern world is financially compressed. Here's what that means. When confidence cracks today, bond markets react immediately, interest rates spike fast, currencies weaken rapidly, political pressure explodes at home. There is no grace period. And just like Britain, America is carrying the same structural load. A global military footprint, a reserve currency role, a consumption-based economy, rising debt to sustain all three. This combination worked for decades, but systems don't break because they stop working. They break because they become too expensive to maintain. Britain learned this when interest payments and defense costs began competing with domestic stability. America is approaching the same crossroads. More debt now means higher interest costs. Later, tighter budgets, less room to respond to crises. And here's the part that makes this era more dangerous. Britain faced competition mainly from one rising power. America faces multiple. China doesn't need to replace the dollar. It only needs to reduce dependence on it. Russia doesn't need to defeat NATO. It only needs to raise costs. Middle powers don't need to challenge America directly. They only need alternatives. That's how influence erodes. Not through attack, through options. This is why the comparison to Britain isn't dramatic. It's structural. Empires fall when the cost of leadership exceeds the benefit of control. Britain crossed that line quietly. America is approaching it loudly, with debt debates, trade wars, sanctions, and global strain visible all at once. And here's the most uncomfortable truth. When Britain lost dominance, it didn't get weaker overnight. It got less flexible. And loss of flexibility is the real beginning of decline. There's a phase every empire enters that is more dangerous than open decline. Not collapse, not weakness, not chaos, overconfidence under pressure. This is the phase where power still exists, but choices begin to disappear. Britain entered this phase in the early 20th century. On paper, everything still looked strong. The Royal Navy ruled the seas. London was still the financial capital. The empire still covered vast territory. But underneath, the math had turned hostile. Every decision required more money. Every response required more debt. Every crisis demanded more force. And here's the mistake empires make in this phase. They believe power can fix structural problems. Britain thought more control would solve rising costs, more military reach, more enforcement, more borrowing. But power cannot fix math. Debt compounds. Interest never sleeps. Confidence doesn't negotiate. By the time Britain realized it needed to step back, markets had already stepped away. Now, look at America. The United States still has unmatched military strength control over major financial institutions, enormous cultural and narrative influence. But the cost of using power is rising faster than before. Sanctions used to be rare. Now they're routine. Military deterrence used to stabilize regions. Now it often prolongs tension. Debt used to be cheap. Now interest itself is a national expense. This creates a trap. When systems tighten, leaders face three options. 1, pull back, arrow risk looking weak. 2, compromise, arrow risk, losing leverage. 3, escalate, arrow delay consequences. Empires almost always choose option 3. Britain did. America is doing the same. But escalation doesn't solve imbalance. It only buys time. And time bought with debt is never neutral. It always comes with conditions. Britain learned this after World War II, when it needed American loans just to function. Those loans didn't come free. They came with influence, with leverage, with leadership quietly changing hands. America may learn this lesson differently, not through invasion, not through surrender, but through constraint. Higher borrowing costs, reduced policy freedom, less ability to respond to shocks. That's how dominance fades in modern systems, not with flags coming down, but with options disappearing. This is why the world war framing misses the real risk. Empires don't usually fall because they lose wars. They fall because they win the wrong battles. Britain won World War I and still declined. Why? When an empire reaches the point where debt finances, stability power substitutes for trust, force replaces flexibility, it enters the most fragile stage of all. Still strong, still feared, but no longer adaptable. This is the phase where mistakes become irreversible. And this is exactly where Britain stood just before it lost control of its future. History doesn't usually end empires with explosions. It ends them with decisions delayed too long. By the end of World War II, Britain still existed. The flag still flew. The institutions still functioned. But something critical was gone. Choice. Britain had reached the point where every path forward carried pain, but some paths were still survivable. And Britain finally faced the decision it had avoided for decades, not between victory and defeat, but between adjustment and denial. For years, Britain had tried to do everything at once: defend the world's reserve currency, maintain global military dominance, fund a domestic economy under pressure. Eventually, the math forced a verdict. Britain chose adjustment, not because it wanted to, but because denial had become impossible. Colonies were released. Military commitments were reduced. The empire accepted a smaller role in a changed world. To many at the time, this felt like humiliation. But history shows something important. Britain didn't disappear. It transformed. It remained influential, respected, stable. It survived because it adjusted before collapse forced the terms. Now turn back to America. The United States still has something Britain barely had at the end. Time. Not unlimited time, but real time. The U.S. still controls key systems, still shapes global finance, still commands military reach, still attracts capital. But the window is narrowing, because every year of delay increases. Debt servicing costs political polarization, dependence on escalation, fragility of global trust. The hardest truth for empires to accept is this: you don't lose power when you choose limits. You lose power when limits choose you. America's real decision isn't about China or Russia or war. It's about how much strain the system can carry before it stops being flexible. Empires don't fall when they are challenged. They fall when they try to respond to every challenge the same way, with more force, more spending, more pressure. That strategy works until it doesn't, and when it stops working, it stops suddenly. The lesson Britain learned, painfully, is this: subscribe a G empires.